right. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining today, especially during Pollinator Week. I know there's a lot going on. Great to have all of you. And so we're happy to introduce the new Bumblebee agreement that we've been working on over the past year or so with a number of partners, which we'll share here shortly. But we want to share this to talk through, why this agreement is needed, what it is, what it entails, and sort of what's required as a result. How it works alongside the Monarch CCAA, since many of you are familiar with that agreement or maybe involved with it yourself. We'll also talk about the timeline, when it'll be finalized, and then where, of course, you can engage, support it, and learn more information. And so just a reminder, we are recording this webinar for those who couldn't join today, so they can watch it, or you can watch it for your future reference. Next slide. So like Catherine mentioned, we wanted to launch an introductory poll, help us understand a little bit more from where you're coming from, what your interest, what your background is. And so we will launch that here in just a moment and take a moment for you to answer that. So it's there in the chat. If you can click on that and answer these two questions. What industry do you represent? So what's your background from a work perspective, and then maybe on a more personal, maybe a work perspective, what brings you to this webinar? What interests you in terms of learning about this Bumblebee agreement? So we'll give that a couple seconds here, and then we'll share those responses just so we can all know where we're coming from. We have a number of people here today on the call and the webinar, so again, appreciate everybody taking time to join us today. It's really great to see everybody. Great. So when we have those, I'll let you, Megan, if you can share your screen if you have those results handy.
I am looking at the results. On my end, I'm not seeing the responses.
Okay, or maybe Allison, if you have those handy, maybe you can share those.
Yeah, so sorry. I'm not seeing them either, but working on it. Thanks.
Great. Okay, excellent. So again, still submit your responses if you haven't done so yet. Looks like we've got about half of people here responding already, which is great to see. And it looks like a large number of you are coming from the transportation sector, as well as the electric utility industry, a number of consultants, contractors, as well as agency staff, and then representation from others. So great to see good diversity. That's what we've seen engaged in some of these past conversations in the CCA and other agreements. So great to see all that. Great. And then the second question, if we have that, in terms of what brings you here today, looks like for a number of you, it's that concern about endangered species listings and obviously regulations that could affect your work, the work that your company is doing, your organization is doing. And then also right alongside that is the interest in just bumblebee conservation itself. And I think that is the thing that motivates what we're doing here today and what we'll share with you. So looks like you're a good audience for this discussion, for this agreement. So again, thank you for joining here. All right, thanks for sharing that. Okay, so you go to the next slide. If you're not familiar, I think many of you are already, but the Rights Ways Habitat Working Group is housed out of the University of Illinois Chicago's Energy Resources Center, managed by the Sustainable Landscapes Program, of which Megan, myself, Catherine, and others on the team here make up that program. And the working group really exists to convene people at this intersection of biodiversity and infrastructure. So you may have been involved with some of our past meetings, some of our roundtables, other initiatives. This is another outpouring of that intersection. So how do we focus and bring conservation around infrastructure that benefits both of those? And so this collaboration is something that we've been facilitating now for a number of years across a number of organizations, and of course that means a number of people. And it's great to have representation and involvement across really two countries, the US and Canada, with this. And so all this work that we're doing could not be possible without that collaboration. That knowledge sharing and information sharing is really, really critical to all that we're doing. Next slide. So keeping along that same vein, the work that we're doing here is only made possible through the funding and dedication of a number of people and organizations. Funding for this work has been provided through the Fish and Wildlife Service and through the Wisconsin DNR. The administrative support of the university that, of course, houses the center has been really, really important. And then also the generous kind of in-kind and financial match that's been provided to help support that grant through a number of our industry advisory team partners, which you can see here on the screen. And so again, they've been heavily involved. Those commitments help us to leverage that funding to do this work. Next slide. In addition to that, there's also been, and I think some of you are on the call, engagement from the conservation community. So we've engaged with a number of partners, as we call it, our sort of conservation technical team or technical representatives that have reviewed and given input at different stages during the development to help inform this from that conservation perspective. And that has been really, really helpful as well. And so, again, we're bringing together the conservation, the industry needs, and the regulatory needs to build this agreement that we're sharing here today. So again, thank you for that input. Okay, so move on. Why don't we pass this over to Megan. And Megan, you can talk a little bit about why we're doing this.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so obviously answering the question why is an important piece to, the driving force behind us creating this agreement and going forward with this effort. Bumblebees need our help. There are several species that we've seen huge declines of more than 50%, and the driving force for a lot of those declines is habitat loss across the U.S., and that has resulted in a number of species of bumblebees and pollinators declining over the years, and pollinators play such a huge role in our food sources and our economy and just for the greater biodiversity. So our agreement is targeting currently 11 different species, and I'll get into which ones in a moment. A few of those are already listed under the ESA, with additional 6 of those being petitioned to be listed. And we're using conservation measures in order to address these declining needs. So long story short, bumblebees need our help. So I mentioned habitat loss and degradation, but there are several other threats that need to be addressed and have conservation needs. So in addition to habitat degradation, there is also climate change, pathogens, competition from bumblebees, the small population size because of all these other threats, really continuing that issue. And so this agreement is looking to address these different threats through a variety of conservation measures in order to address the things that are continuing to cause bumblebee numbers to decline across the U.S. This is the list of those 11 bumblebee species that are currently included in the agreement. They range from bumblebees that are already listed under the ESA to some that are petitioned to some that are of interest. And you can see there the IUCN status, which just further proves the point that these are species that need to be focused on in this agreement, as well as their estimated declines over the years. And we are writing the agreement in a way that we hope to include other bees and maybe other pollinators in the future. So as different bumblebee species need our help and need addressing, we are hoping to add those to this list as well. And you can see those different species along this timeline of the federal status. to give you a little background on how federal listings work, usually there's a petition that's filed with the Fish and Wildlife Service, which does get review, and then it's determined if this is a species that should be addressed, and it's put into the Fish and Wildlife Service work plan on different species that they're addressing, and then a proposed rule comes out on whether it's threatened or endangered, or it's determined to not warrant a listing. But if it is determined a listing, then after the proposed rule comes out, the final rule is put into place about a year after. So these different species along that timeline are moving towards kind of the red critical status that the rusty patch and the Franklin bumblebee currently are at. So if you're looking at those 11 different species and not sure if they apply to you or not sure if they affect the area that you're currently working in, we do have this map. It's also available on our website if you're familiar with that, but we have a QR code, and that brings you to an interactive map that Stantec has put together with us to create this interactive map where you can zoom in on the area you operate, or if you're a consultant, the area you're consulting in, to see which species might be of concern to you and might be of interest, especially if you're an energy and transportation organization. Then this agreement is something that you can apply for and enroll in. So I recommend checking out that map. And can someone please put a link to that map in the chat for easy access? So yeah, it's a neat tool, and I recommend checking it out. So another reason why organizations have concerns around these different listings is that it does usually cause increased workload and project delays, not only for these different organizations, but also U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So a agreement such as this is something that we can do to offset some of that work and be proactive about our conservation work. It's something that we can start doing now for bumblebees and not waiting for those species that are not yet listed to be listed. So there's a lot of concerns around like the additional workload and the delays to projects and the complexity that new species being listed. So this is the solution that we found. So that's another reason why we're creating this agreement, is to address the species loss, but also to find a solution for this added complexity that happens with new species being listed. So this agreement is voluntary conservation focused. So organizations commit to doing a certain level of conservation work on their land, and in return, in partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Service, they receive assurances that the species that are listed or about to be listed, since they are committing to doing voluntary conservation, they won't be asked to do additional work outside of what is included in this agreement. So there's covered activities that are included. So it really reduces some of that uncertainty that comes with new species being listed. It's a really nice partnership between both energy and transportation organizations and the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's a way for us to come together and work together to address these species needs. And it really adds a lot of momentum as well. We're not waiting, like I mentioned, for these species to be listed. We are doing conservation work, now and when the agreement is hopefully open for enrollment. For those of you who are not familiar, the Bumblebee Agreement is something that is building off of the success of another agreement that we administer here at the University of Illinois Chicago and that is the Monarch CCAA. So it's the Monarch Canada Conservation Agreement with assurances. This is an agreement that has been open for enrollment since April of 2020, and it was the first of its kind, the first nationwide agreement. And we've since then gotten a lot of great participation, and it's still open for enrollment, so I only anticipate these numbers growing. We recently surpassed the 1 million acres of habitat conservation committed to the program, which is a huge milestone, and we're coming up on our 5th year. And you can see there is participation from almost all of the continental states that are eligible to enroll in this program. So it's definitely great to see, and we're creating this agreement to really be in line with the Monarch CCA to make participating in both as easy as possible. And with that, I will turn it back over to Dan.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Yeah, so now I want to dive a little bit more into what the agreement actually includes and entails. So if we go to the next slide, this is really building off of what Megan was just sharing, where, again, it's this give and take of bringing about and promoting and encouraging voluntary conservation in exchange for these regulatory assurances or predictability. Going back to those intro polls, many of you coming from utility, energy or transportation sectors, I think understand that it's great to do conservation. We try to do that when we can, but that predictability, that regulatory consideration, really helps kind of build that lasting engagement and provides that business case for providing that conservation. And so it's really that combination that these agreements are all about. And so we're hoping this helps expand and enhance bumblebee habitat, again, for those at-risk species, as well as other pollinators that rely on those same habitats. And also, just like Megan just shared, building on that success of the Monarch CCAA. It's great to see that we're at 1 million acres of commitments just in the first 4 years of that program and continue to see that grow. So we want to leverage that success now to help benefit other species as well. So if we go to the next slide, thinking about those conservation objectives for this agreement, it's really focused on improving, sustaining, foraging, nesting, and overwintering habitat, right? So those 3 sort of habitat aspects that bumblebees rely on. And as a result, sustaining or increasing populations and their geographic range. And so again, those have really driven what's being put into this conservation agreement. This has been brought about, again, from those different partners that we shared at the onset, right? The collaboration between the Fish and Wildlife Service, UIC, and other partners, the industry advisory team that's been advising and weighing in or reviewing aspects as we've been diving into it, and all those conservation partners who've weighed in and shared input and knowledge and data and perspectives as well. It's been really great to pull all that into this. Of course, conservation for bumblebees is nothing new. Many of you are involved with that already. If you go to the next slide, some of the objectives that we've identified for this come out of existing recovery plans for species. And so of the 11 species we have, there's 2 that are currently listed. There's the Franklin's bumblebee, as well as the rusty patch bumblebee. So Franklin's being in the Pacific Northwest, rusty patch being in the upper Midwest primarily. And so within those recovery plans, there's already stated objectives for the conservation needs of those species. Of course, there's other objectives and plans for bumblebees outside of the service-developed plans through the ESA that are available that we've reviewed as well in the course of developing this. So the next slide. So we've looked at those across the different range of bumblebees that we've included. And so you can look at that map that we have here for those individual species and think about where the lands that you occupy or manage are located, and you can see that 1 or more species are located there. These are the same ranges that you'll find on that online map that was shared. So you can access that map, and that's a little more interactive. You can zoom into particular locations. That also has a wealth of generalized records that are reflective of data from the bumblebees of North America. So working with the authors of that and Search Society, we were able to basically generalize and input that data into that map. So you can see sort of where some of those occurrences are in the landscape. But again, they're generalized to roughly a 5-kilometer, sort of buffered area. So combined, these cover the lower 48 states of the U.S. Again, that's the same geographic scope as the Monarch CCAA. So if you're enrolled in that or thinking about that, the sort of extent of coverage is the same. And just like that, it covers energy and transportation lands. And so those are broad terms that include multiple sectors, like you can see listed here. I think when we think about transportation too, we think about not just roadsides, but also railroads, as well as other transport methods, right? There's transportation of data, of water, things like that are also transportation infrastructure for commodities, goods, services, those types of things. Go to the next slide. And so as you think about that, that's the conservation aspect of this. Then there's the regulatory benefits that come from this. And so those assurances really come from several different avenues through the authorization of an agreement like this. There's the Enhancement of Survival Permit that's issued under Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act. In issuing that, the service has to conduct their own Section 7 review to verify that it's not going to result in adverse impacts to or jeopardize other listed species under the Endangered Species Act, as well as making sure that we're achieving that net benefit target of these conservation benefit agreements, right? So we're not just one-for-one mitigating for any impacts from activities, but we're actually exceeding that. We want to create more bumblebees, expand their ranges, do good things for all of these species in the landscape. And so that Section 7 review has to analyze that, think about that, and verify that that is the case, that we're achieving that net benefit standard. And then, of course, within the agreement and with those documents is that assurance that if you're signing up for this, if you're enrolling and making those upfront commitments, that the service isn't going to require anything additional or different in terms of management activities relative to those species, right? So that assurance, that predictability is a really, really important aspect of that. Go to the next slide. When we think about what are the types of activities that are covered, let's say, by that permit, so again, where is that incidental take coverage being extended to for ongoing activities? We think about the operations, maintenance, and modernization activities that happen on energy and transportation lands. And so I have some examples in each of those buckets of what those types of things are. Those range from activities that happen daily, right, like highway and road use, access and inspections, to things that happen maybe monthly or annually, like maintenance activities, vegetation management, facilities maintenance, and then modernization, which is really the fact that we have this infrastructure, but it's in constant need of repair, rebuilding, upgrading, and in some cases, expansion to accommodate the growing needs of the population. And so there's a broad suite of activities that are included in there across those different activities, but the coverage is being extended to those as proposed in the agreement. And again, that aligns with what we have in the Monarch CCAA. So if we go to the next slide, a little bit more about what's required. So if you're signing up for this, if you're interested in enrolling, what is actually being asked of you as part of that? So if we go to the next slide, again, if you're familiar with the Monarch CCAA, it very much mirrors the sort of framework of what's included in there. You're selecting a series of conservation measures that you're committing to. So back to what Megan mentioned earlier, we've reached that 1 million acre mark within the Monarch CCAA. And so the fact that, that those are all conservation measures and commitments being made by those partners enrolled. Aside from that implementation of conservation on the ground, there's an additional monitoring component where you're monitoring a subset of lands to verify that there's the habitat components that we're looking for with these covered species. Annually, those conservation measures are tracked, and then the monitoring and tracking of those conservation measures is reported back to UIC, who's the program administrator for this. And then that is extended to Fish and Wildlife Service. So Fish and Wildlife Service, as the permit issuer, receives those reports, reviews that, and keeps an eye on the program, making sure it's achieving that net benefit that's desired. And of course, underlying all that is compliance with all other federal, tribal, and state laws in conjunction with those types of activities. So speaking about the conservation measures, if you go to the next slide, within the agreement, we've identified 5 different objectives for these at-risk bumblebees. And if you're familiar with bumblebee conservation, none of these are probably surprising to you. That's the things that we're trying to do to alleviate those key threats or causes of declines of these different species. And so you can see with each of those objectives, we've associated a series of conservation measures. What we show in that bottom part of the slide is really just a snippet or a subset of some of the measures that are available in this kind of menu of measures associated with each of these objectives. And if you go to the next slide, the way that we're thinking about this in the agreement and the way we want people to engage in this is to go through a series of steps to select and define which conservation measures are appropriate for them to basically implement. And so across those 5 different objectives, right, and the suite of different measures associated with them, we're not expecting them all to be applied everywhere consistently at the same way. If you're a roadside versus a power line versus a solar facility, you might implement and choose different measures along the way. So at first, there is a commitment upfront to maintaining some idle lands, that is sort of temporary set-asides that are left to protect nesting and overwintering, as well as if you were to come across a nest site of one of these rare species, that would be protected if found. So that's the baseline commitment. Beyond that, enrollees are asked to choose 3 of those remaining 4 objectives. So of those 3 of 4, they have to select then one conservation measure with each of those 3 objectives selected. And then those are what are being implemented and then tracked and then reported at the end of the year. Of course, like we've seen with the CSA, some people go above and beyond that bare minimum. And we're trying to encourage incentives for people to go above and beyond just a single selection for each objective, just so they can diversify that conservation that they're implementing on the ground. But as far as minimum expectations, that's what we've sort of outlined in terms of the procedure for the agreement. If you go to the next slide, think about what that looks like on the ground. We have a kind of a basic visual that shows that. And you can think about this box being, it could be 1 acre, it could be 1,000 acres, it could be 10,000 acres. But we have these 3 colors, the gray, which is the infrastructure, again, that could be a road or a power line or pipeline. And then within the rest of the space, we have sort of active operations and maintenance, right? The maintenance activities that have to happen. We have to mow things for vegetation management. Maybe there's herbicide applications. And then beyond that, there's a lot of other green space that could be sort of, is periodic maintenance or, again, maybe some modernization. But those are areas that are touched, less frequently over the course of operations, right? Maybe it's monthly, maybe it's annually, maybe it's every few years. And as a baseline, that's sort of just out there on the landscape today. And so what we're asking in this enrollment is essentially committing to maintaining a certain amount of set-asides. So at least 5% of what's enrolled, and that can be scaled greater. And so that's what those arrows are indicating on the right, is that we've seen that sort of fluctuate depending on what people's abilities are based on the lands that they're managing. And then that yellow part below, that's where we envision a lot of these active conservation measures being applied, right? When you're out there doing vegetation management, do it in a way that enhances habitat, protects species, and those resources that need for that. And so when those activities are occurring, we're looking for a minimum of 3% of those lands achieving these each year. And we've settled on these numbers because that's what we've seen happening already through Monarch CCA enrollment. That's also what we've gotten feedback from industry in terms of what's reasonable to expect in an annual sort of cycle, right? We're not doing work everywhere all the time. It's just often a subset. So when we're out there doing that, let's do that in a way that protects these species. Beyond that, you'll notice that hatching on the right side, which is different from what's on the left in that baseline scenario. And that really is there to represent that there's other measures that go beyond just that active or inactive sort of land management. This is things like nest avoidance. This is things like developing an IPM plan to reduce or eliminate, pesticide uses. It could be, other measures associated with training and education of workers. So there's other measures that would broadly be applied across the whole system of lands that are enrolled. So hopefully that paints a little bit of a picture in terms of what enrollment could look like and gets you thinking about how that might apply on lands that you manage. Next slide, or next slide. Great. So I mentioned monitoring. The monitoring commitments, again, if you're familiar with what's in the Monarch CCA, are meant to overlap and align with those. So if you're out there doing monitoring for the CCAA, it should be very easy to just fold in the Bumblebee monitoring with that same level of effort. And so we're mirroring that protocol that's used in that agreement, again, to try to minimize the amount of additional work we're asking people to do. The monitoring is really focused on these two questions you see here on the slide. Do those enrolled lands support that foraging, nesting, and overwintering habitat needs of those covered species? And then are the conservation measures, right, that are being deployed as part of this helping to sustain, create, and enhance the habitat we're looking for? And so with that, if you go to the next slide, that means that we're looking at a select set of variables in that monitoring. Again, we're trying to make this as accessible and available for people, even people who necessarily aren't biologists, as part of their day job, who are being asked to do this monitoring. So we're using things like the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group scorecard to engage people in conducting these. Again, we've seen good monitoring happening through the Monarch CCAA, and understanding the capabilities and experience has been helpful there. So we're looking at, obviously, the number, timing, and location of sampling. And in each of those locations, we're looking for the percent cover of potentially flowering nectar plants, or so flowering plants. They don't have to be in bloom necessarily when you're there, but at some point during the growing season, they're going to be flowering. We want the number of potentially flowering species. So not asking for species identification by name, but the number of different species observed to be present. And then we have a checklist of different nesting and overwintering features that can be identified if they're found in that monitoring plot. Then, of course, for those who can go above and beyond, we try to encourage that. And so that's where optional data that could be collected includes things like native and invasive species cover, observations of bumblebees or other pollinators, and then plant species identified in those plots. So again, those are optional. Having the scale between required versus optional data, we find is a good balance to sort of meet people where they're at, but give the option to add to that data set where people can. All right, next slide. And then, of course, at the end of the year, that gets wrapped up into reporting. All partners report back to the program administrator, again, University of Illinois, Chicago. That annual report then gets compiled, summarizing all those partner contributions in terms of what the enrollment is, how much conservation they're providing, where it's occurring, any additional outreach that's conducted, and then what we expect over the next year. And so I have just a snippet from a graphic here that we have from our recent Monarch CCA reporting, where we can, we're taking some of that monitoring data, aggregating it, and helping to tell that story of what we're seeing out there on these adopted acres where these conservation measures are being undertaken. All right, moving right along. So that naturally kind of feeds into the next question. Well, if you are enrolled in the Monarch CCA, or if you're thinking about it, how does this work alongside of it? And I've mentioned it in a few ways, but just to illustrate a couple examples as we're kind of getting towards the end here. In the Monarch CCA, we have this adopted acres, enrolled acres sort of distinction, right? So you can enroll everything, and then there's a subset of adopted acres where you're doing those practices. In the Bumblebee agreement, we're just asking you to enroll that same area of enrolled lands, and those conservation measures, again, depending on what they are applied in those same areas of adopted acres, or if they're more programmatic, again, like an IPM plan of sorts, or training, those happen just kind of throughout the whole system. So that distinction is a little bit different, but on the ground, if you're going out and doing a targeted herbicide treatment for one, it's applicable to the other. So it's that the on the ground aspects align in that regard. To share that another way, if you go to the next slide, I'll pull up those boxes again that we have in terms of kind of that conceptual illustration. And so like you can see on the left with the Monarch CCAA, you're doing those habitat set-aside commitments and those active conservation measures. And so it looks a lot like what we looked at on the previous slide or a few slides back, which we have replicated there on the right. So again, from a Bumblebee agreement perspective, you're doing many of those similar actions on the ground. There's that added aspect, though, of making sure that those minimum commitments are met, that there's also things like nest avoidance and other programmatic conservation measures that get incorporated there as well. So again, there's very close overlap with the implementation of those, and that's intentional. We want that because understandably, as a roadside manager, as a power line vegetation manager, as a pipeline manager, you like to do conservation when you can, but at the end of the day, you're delivering power, you're providing safe transport, and this has to fit within all those objectives. So if you go to the next slide, the last aspect in terms of overlap I want to touch on is the administrative aspect, because again, like any program, like any commitments, you have to document, track, report those. And so we've really done a lot of work here to make those requirements overlap as much as possible. And so again, in terms of timing, the types of tracking, the types of monitoring, the reporting mechanisms, having that all sort of align. So it's a similar lift in terms of what you're doing already for the Monarch CCA would be encouraged here. And again, we're trying to diversify that conservation investment with that perspective, right? So if you can just do a little bit more to help out a number of additional species, we want to make that bar easy to engage on. I think one of the main differences when we think about with this agreement is that regulatory coverage aspect, in that the Monarch CCA, of course, is just a single species, whereas this, again, is covering 11 different species. And those aren't necessarily all occurring in the area where you might be managing lands, but a number of them might be. So again, check out that map, see which ones maybe apply, and that can help you start to visualize what enrollment could look like. Okay, so with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Megan to talk a little bit more about when this is going to be finalized, what our timeline is, and where you can learn more. Megan?
Thanks, Dan. So we have been working on this agreement for a little over a year now in earnest. There was some initial prototyping happening in 2021, and then we worked to get the funding needed and began developing this in spring of 2023. And just recently, maybe about a month ago, we did submit it to Fish and Wildlife Service for formal review. So now they're taking a look at that, and eventually it'll be open up for public comment, and those comments will be reviewed, and the agreement will be updated. And so that we're all thinking will hopefully take around 6 or 7 months. So we're really hoping that this agreement is ready for enrollment come the end of this year. So, we passed a big milestone submitting it to Fish and Wildlife Service for review, and now we're working with them on that process. So anticipating enrollment at the end of this year, but please check in on our website and reach out to us if you have any questions about the timing of that. But in the meantime, you can start to prepare for enrollment. You might want to take a look at that map and consider which bees are something that you need to focus on, or you'd like to focus on. Consider how you can start incorporating some of these conservation measures that we've outlined into your integrative vegetation management plans. You can review the draft agreement during the public comment period and start to get an idea of the details and how your organization can implement this and start to enroll. If you're not already, enrolling in the Monarch CCA is also a great way to get a running start on understanding how these conservation agreements work, and that's something that you can enroll in now. So it's something that you can start working on and getting coverage from our monarchs now. And you can also work with us to support this agreement in the program. So we have a whole suite of things and tools and webinars for you to take advantage of. We host bi-monthly meetings that are open to anyone who's interested on the Monarch TCA, where we also give some brief updates about the Bumblebee agreement from time to time. So getting acquainted with that. There's a lot of different avenues, and it's a good first step if you're really interested in figuring out how to get your organization enrolled in this new Bumblebee agreement effort. To expand a little bit on supporting the agreement and the program, we are always open to new knowledge or research. So if you have find anything interesting, please send it our way. That Bumblebee agreement map, for example, was really made possible by a lot of great data that was provided by the Xerces Society. So any sort of way that you can collaborate with us, we are very open to that. The Rights of Way Working Group is all about collaboration and coming together to share resources and knowledge to better address this need for habitat on working lands. Highlight the importance of these agreements and our work to your leadership. We're happy to sit in on different webinars or meetings to lay out what these agreements, what the benefit of them are and how they work. When that public review period comes out, probably mid to late summer, you can submit your support for it during that period. I mentioned connecting with the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group and staying involved in that. If there's anyone else that you think would be interested in learning more about that, letting them know that this is an effort that's underway and something that they could potentially benefit from. And then we also do have an industry advisory team that's open for organizations that want to commit either financial support or in-kind time. So a little bit more on that in a moment, but here is a link to our Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group website. You can stay up to date on the Bumblebee agreement there. Yep, great. That link is in the chat. But as I mentioned, joining the industry advisory team, this is something that we meet about once a month for, and it's reviewing different documents and providing your feedback. And there's other benefits to joining the team. There is going to be some reduced enrollment fees, and it's a way to connect with the industry and your peers. It is for organizations that either own, manage, or support energy or transportation lands. So it is for industry members to join. We do have a few other collaborative groups that that potentially, if you are interested and you aren't an industry member, could potentially add you to those groups. So if you're interested, that is my email, and we can get you set up and get you involved in the meetings and access the different documents that are being reviewed. And it's another good way to jumpstart your consideration for enrollment. Another shout out to our industry advisory team members. We wouldn't have been able to get to where we are, wouldn't have been able to have an agreement that really took into account what industry members would be willing to implement, and making sure that the agreement we were putting together is something that's actually going to be enrolled in. So appreciate all the generous, kind, and time that different industry members have provided over the last year or so. Another thank you to the conservation technical team. So these are organizations that are really more focused on the conservation aspect, making sure that what we're putting together is something that benefits bees and would be a helpful agreement to have in terms of creating habitat for bees and hopefully increasing their numbers over time. And thank you to our project funders. So a lot of this work was funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Section 6 grant in partnership with the Wisconsin DNR. UIC is supporting on the administrative side of this, and the industry advisory team that we mentioned, they've also been huge on making sure that we have that financial match needed for that grant and in-kind time match needed. So really wanted to give one last thank you to everyone at the end of this webinar.